Dance with the Devil by Jason Brannon, Chapter 1. The sound of breaking glass made Solomon Sharpe sit up too quickly on the sofa. He cursed as the pain behind his eyes blossomed like cherry bomb explosions. He pulled his .45 from beneath the dingy green couch cushion and surveyed the room with one half-opened eye, holding a gun out in front of him like a protective ward. A whiskey bottle lay in pieces beside the coffee table. Poe, the black cat, who was also the guardian of Sharpe's humble abode, stared at him with emerald eyes, proclaiming his innocence. Sharpe and the cat maintained an uneasy friendship. At the moment, he didn't believe in the cat's innocence, but the throbbing in his head made it impossible to do more than stare bleary-eyed at the feline and try to remember why he had gotten into this line of work in the first place. The cat made an attempt at playing nice by walking over to rub against his leg. Sharpe swatted half-heartedly at the animal and received a hiss in return. The simple act was enough to make colors dance before his eyes. His ribs felt like kindling that had been broken, doused with kerosene, and lit with a match. He gingerly raised his shirt and saw a patchwork of yellow and purple bruises, and the memories of how they'd gotten there came rushing back. His head swam as if filled with wet cement. Inside of his mouth felt like it had been carpeted in green shag. He nearly blacked out trying to get to his feet. He sat back down on the couch for a moment, clinging to consciousness and dignity. At first, he wasn't sure what time it was. It seemed like he had been asleep for hours, but a quick glance at his watch showed that it was only a little after 5 in the evening. Solomon sighed. He hadn't even been out for an hour. "Sweet angel of death, take me now," he groaned as he set his gun on the scuffed coffee table and clutched his head with both hands. The death angel tattoo on his forearm, which he had affectionately named Brahm, seemed to mock him, laughing at his predicament. The Reaper waved his scythe in jest, amused at Solomon's current situation. Sometimes he liked to have imaginary conversations with the characters inked on his body when he was trying to reason something out or talk something through. It probably wasn't the healthiest way to ponder a problem, but then again, when had he ever done things the way they were supposed to be done? He had felt like this on far too many occasions to count after a drunken night of celebrating a closed case. But he wasn't hungover, and he hadn't tested the limits of his liver's capacity to process alcohol the night before. It was the goose egg on the back of his head, and not whiskey, that was to blame for the feeling of nausea in his gut. It was the beating he had suffered at the hands of an angry man that accounted for the aching in every extremity of his body. Normally, running surveillance on a cheating spouse was easy money. Typically, though, that sort of work was predicated on the fact that the cheating spouse didn't know they were being watched. This time had been different. The cheating spouse had known, and she had told her lover that they were being spied upon. Incidentally, the man was a mixed martial arts fighter with a specialty in Muay Thai. The rest of the story basically wrote itself from there. After obtaining some cursory information from his client, the suspecting husband, earlier in the day, Solomon knew that the object of his surveillance normally took lunch around 2 in the afternoon. The husband had found a matchbook from the Hideaway Motel, one of the Valley Falls' seediest motels, in the wife's car, which had given Solomon a starting point. The job seemed like a slam dunk. Solomon had parked his car in the motel parking lot at 1 o'clock in hopes that the lovebirds would make an appearance today. It was supposed to be quick and easy money. He had spent an hour camped out in his car, which smelled like week-old burgers, soggy fries, and cigarettes smoked down to the filter. Then, a little after 2 o'clock, the lovebirds showed up, pawing and grabbing at each other like a couple of randy teenagers. Solomon had taken a few pictures of the pair as they went into their room and then had little to do but sit there as he waited for the lunch hour to end. He made the mistake of closing his eyes for a few minutes, thinking that he had time to relax while the lovers did their thing. He was planning to take a few more snapshots when the adulterers came back, when out of nowhere the driver's side window of his gold 1998 Buick Century shattered into a million pieces. Apparently, Muay Thai guy had come out of the motel room while Solomon was resting his eyes. Without warning, Solomon was hauled through the empty window out into the parking lot. The fact that it was in broad daylight seemed to make no difference to Muay Thai guy. From there, the memory was fragmented. A flurry of fists and kicks delivered by military-style boots. Solomon's camera being hurled against the pavement where it shattered into a million Chinese-made pieces. A few more kicks to the ribs with a few insults and profanities sprinkled in for good measure. Then darkness. Although he couldn't be sure, Solomon thought Brahm, his Death Angel tattoo, might have been laughing at him when this past part happened. Brahm had a cruel sense of humor and was usually most amused whenever Solomon was getting the crap beaten out of him. The thing about getting beaten up at the Hideaway Motel is the guarantee that there will be no witnesses. Every occupant is blind, deaf, and dumb. It's one reason why the Hideaway is so popular. Want to score drugs? The Hideaway is your place. Want to buy a handgun that's had the serial number filed off? The Hideaway is your place. Want to step out on your husband? You guessed it. The Hideaway. More illegal activities happened at this roach motel than any other place in the city. New cops were usually assigned to the Hideaway because it provided training on the most crimes in the shortest amount of time. It was just that kind of place. The locals knew to avoid it. The criminals knew to frequent it. All the good private investigators in town knew to make a trip there during whatever investigation they were working on because there was a good chance it factored in somehow. All Solomon knew about the Hideaway was that he never wanted to see it again. After laying on the pavement for what seemed like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, Solomon remembered staggering to his feet. The side of his face was swollen and covered in a gooey mixture of blood and sweat. Gravel and bits of glass stuck to his cheek. He tested his teeth with his tongue, and one of them wiggled when it shouldn't have. The inside of his mouth tasted coppery, like he'd been sucking on a penny. Solomon managed to get back into his car and then promptly passed out. When he woke up, it was because a bum was tapping on his windshield, hoping Solomon could spare $1. The bum stopped once he got a good look at the man behind the wheel. Solomon started his car and drove slowly all the way home, doing everything he could to resist passing out again. He made it to the front door of his crackerbox apartment, managed to insert the key into the lock with a hand that shook like someone afflicted with a palsy, and promptly collapsed on a sofa that looked like it had been color-matched with baby puke. As he ran back through every detail about the case that had resulted in him getting the crap beat out of him, one in a long line of memories he wouldn't mind forgetting, he also thought about the amount of the check he had received as a retainer for the job. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. He needed a new line of work. With a series of groans and a lot of effort, Solomon Sharpe got up from the sofa and made it to the kitchen table. He found a bottle of aspirin that he had neglected to put away, and he shook 3 into his hand. The effort was painful enough that he reconsidered and shook a 4th pill out of the bottle for good measure. He popped the white tablets into his mouth, grimacing at the chalky bitterness, and downed the last vestiges of day-old coffee that swirled around in the bottom of his special cup that said, "Sometimes I talk to myself when I need expert advice." The coffee tasted like it had been filtered through a sweat sock, and he winced at the taste. But he managed to get the aspirin down. Alani, the hula girl tattooed on his other forearm, danced and swayed and smiled at him. "You should take better care of yourself," she said, moving to a rhythm that only she could hear. "No kidding," Solomon said, thinking he might need to be checked into Saturn Hills Asylum if he kept talking to his tattoos. "Remind me of that next time before I take another case like this. No, wait a minute. What am I saying? I'm asking my tattoo for advice. Forget what I said. Remember what you're doing with me as a trick that you learned in Afghanistan," Alani reminded him. "You were entrenched for 3 days under heavy fire, and Potter taught you how to do this. It's more of a method of meditation than anything else. You know, I'm not really talking to you, and you aren't really talking to me. It's a way of purging all those temp files in the memory banks of your mind. Housekeeping is how Potter described it." "Housekeeping," Solomon muttered. Sure, that's what this feels like. You've solved a lot of cases by housekeeping, Alani reminded him. Sometimes the answers are there, buried underneath all the details. You just have to do a little cleaning in the corridors of your mind to uncover those answers. Is there any method of housekeeping that will fix my busted ribs? I'm afraid not, Alani answered. This is more of a mental process than a physical one. Solomon nodded and gingerly touched his side. He winced and groaned, but he didn't think he had any permanent damage, though he would be sore for a while. Getting beaten up every now and then went with the territory when you decided to be a private investigator in Valley Falls, a strange little town with a penchant for violence and depravity. Solomon knew he was a mess and decided the thing he needed most was a hot shower. It would be good therapy for aching muscles, would wash all the dirt and blood away, and would hopefully make him feel better. The shower pressure in his building was virtually non-existent, but the water heater worked just fine. It took him a couple of minutes to undress because his body moved much slower through aches and pains than it did under normal circumstances. The delay gave the shower time to get steamy. He took a hard look at himself as he stood in front of the mirror and evaluated what he saw. Salt and pepper hair, 3-day stubble that was mostly black with the occasional patch of white mixed in for good measure. A body that was still in decent shape for a man in his 40s. Crow's feet around eyes that had seen more than their share of hurt and pain. A mishmash of white scars marking his chest and arms in various places that were the result of bullet wounds, knives, and a few that had been made with the smoldering end of a cigarette during a torture session that one of the local mob bosses referred to as an interrogation. Yet, despite all the physical reminders of what he did for a living, everything still worked as it was supposed to. Solomon Sharpe was like a good used car, dinged up in more places than you could count, but still dependable enough to get the job done. He thought about his father, Alphonse Sharpe, one of the richest and most successful men in all of Valley Falls, and the founder and CEO of Sharpe Enterprises. Quite likely, Alphonse Sharpe was getting ready to have dinner at some Valley Falls hotspot. He would order the most expensive things on the menu of the most exclusive restaurant. He would pay without caring that the bill was more than his son would make in a month. And he would tip generously without even considering that his son was fighting for his life in the Valley Falls underbelly. Solomon had never wanted anything from his father and had been determined to become successful on his own. Now was one of the first times he had truly questioned whether he made the right decision, or if there might still be time for the prodigal to come home to open arms and a place at his father's table. He wasn't ready to ask just yet, but he was tired of struggling. Maybe working at Sharpe Enterprises wouldn't be such a bad thing. At the very least, he knew it wouldn't involve getting curb stomped by unseen enemies, and that was important. Sad how such criteria had come to define what separated the good employment opportunities from the bad. Clouds of steam had started to gather around him like ghosts of the people who had died in the apartment building. He stepped into the shower and gasped as the hot water poured out over his aching body, sluicing away dirt and caked-on blood and grime. The way the water swirled and spiraled down the drain reminded Solomon of his own life and his current career trajectory. Standing there, a broken man with a broken life in a broken place, Solomon Sharpe leaned his head against the mildewed tile and paused for self-reflection. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. This wasn't how his life should have turned out. Here he was, a reasonably smart guy with a considerable set of skills, bleeding and battered in an apartment that looked like it was made more for vermin than humans. He needed something bigger, something with a higher profile than a bunch of surveillance cases. He needed a case that would give him a hook with the Valley Falls PD. He needed an important job, a noble job that would justify what he did for a living. He needed a case that would make him feel like he was doing some good in the world. A case like that usually requires clients with money, not those needing dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Solomon stayed in the shower until the hot water ran out. Then he carefully dried off and dressed in ratty jeans and a Black Sabbath t-shirt. He passed by the kitchen table on his way to the refrigerator, grabbed the orange juice carton from inside, and took a long, chilled gulp that made his head hurt from the cold and his ribs ache from the effort of swallowing. Then he paused, realizing there was something on the kitchen table that he had overlooked. It was a bright red envelope that had his name on it in a handwritten scrawl.